The applause began, like a soft tide against marble, swelling beneath chandeliers that trembled under the weight of light. It was the kind of applause meant to be recorded. Timed, polished, perfectly performative. At the center of it all stood Evelyn Hart, her posture immaculate, her expression rehearsed to the millimeter. She had always known how to smile without meaning it. The room shimmered with glass and pretense. Rows of executives sat in deliberate symmetry, the men in dark suits like a chessboard guarding its king. Behind them, screens flickered with her face and the company's emblem, the two bound together by a tagline about integrity and innovation. Integrity. She almost laughed at the word. Evelyn had written that line 3 years ago, in a conference room where the air smelled of burnt coffee and ambition. Back then, she believed words could protect something. Now she knew better. Words were currency. Spent, twisted, erased when inconvenient. Still, she stood beneath the lights, smiling while the CEO praised her dedication to the company's image. Her silence had always been part of her job. She was the voice of the corporation, yet never her own. Every press release she crafted, every crisis she buried beneath calm phrasing, every lie softened into language. It all trained her to disappear behind the tone she built. The ceremony continued with the rhythm of a well-edited reel. Speeches, champagne, laughter that echoed too long. Evelyn listened the way one listens to rain through glass, aware of it, detached from it. She felt the weight of the crystal award in her hands, its edges cold, reflecting the spotlights like 1,000 small eyes. She was being celebrated for silence, for controlling narratives, for saying nothing while saying everything, for keeping the company untarnished while it quietly corroded from within. The irony was a taste she had grown familiar with. When the applause faded, she noticed how easily sound could collapse into nothing. The silence that followed felt heavier than any noise before it. She stared at the crowd, smiling faces, practiced admiration, the illusion of unity. She wondered how many of them knew that the speech they had just heard was the last one she would ever write for them. 3 weeks earlier, the office had smelled of storm air, the kind that carries static, an omen in the walls. Evelyn had been reviewing a confidential report in her glass-walled office, a space meant to symbolize transparency. From where she sat, she could see the reflection of everyone who passed behind her. That was how she noticed the 2 men standing by the corridor that day, speaking in low, urgent tones. She didn't hear their words, not at first, but the reflection told her enough. The stiff shoulders, the pause before one of them checked the hallway. She turned down the volume of her monitor and waited. Their voices reached her through the thin partition. Her name, followed by phrases that lived in the corporate vocabulary of betrayal. Restructuring, realignment, public image, quiet transition. She remembered staring at her own reflection in the glass, her face superimposed over theirs. For a moment, it looked as though she was the one delivering the verdict. That evening, she stayed long after the lights had dimmed. The building, stripped of its daytime pretense, felt skeletal. She moved through the hallways like someone studying a ghost town, her footsteps soft against carpet designed to muffle sound. The company's branding slogans glowed faintly on the walls, fragments of optimism that now read like epitaphs. Trust, vision, unity. She sat in the communications studio, the one she had designed herself, surrounded by the quiet hum of idle machines. Every story the company ever told had been edited here. Every scandal had been dissolved into language she could no longer separate from fiction. She had given them narratives so convincing that even truth had started to sound unprofessional. But the silence that night was different. It wasn't compliance. It was observation. It was the sound of something shifting under the surface. Evelyn had always believed that silence was safety. Growing up, it had been her survival tool. Listening, adapting, reading the temperature of every room before deciding which version of herself to offer. In corporate life, That skill became her greatest asset. She could detect danger before it was spoken aloud. But this time, the danger came from within the system she had built. She spent the next week in near-perfect stillness, the way a chess player studies the board before making the first irreversible move. She reviewed press archives, contracts, and internal statements she had ghostwritten. Every file carried her fingerprint, every polished sentence a trace of her authorship. They had forgotten that words, even when sanitized, still belonged to someone. It wasn't anger that guided her. Anger was too visible, too noisy. What she felt was precision, a quiet calculation that hummed just beneath her pulse. She began to compile documents, voice memos, drafts with metadata intact. She stored them on an encrypted drive, one the company's IT department would never trace, because she had helped design their monitoring system herself. On the second Friday, she received the official notice masked as a promotion review. The phrasing was sterile. Realignment of strategic communication roles. She printed it out, folded it carefully, and placed it in her notebook. The letter would serve its purpose later, but not yet. That weekend, she sat by the window of her apartment overlooking the river. The city shimmered below, full of people mistaking motion for progress. She thought of how applause worked. It began as one person's signal and spread through imitation. No one clapped because they truly understood. They clapped because they didn't want to be the first to stop. That was how the company survived. Synchronized approval, unexamined loyalty, noise disguised as conviction. Evelyn had been part of that orchestra for too long, but she was about to rewrite the music. When Monday came, she arrived early. She spoke to no one, smiled at everyone, and began preparing the next quarterly report, the one that would seal her exit and open a wound they wouldn't see until it was too late. Every line she wrote carried dual meaning, each statistic laced with a truth hidden in plain sight. She wasn't creating a press release. She was creating a record. As the week unfolded, she watched the office perform its routine ballet of power. Meetings about nothing, decisions that had already been made elsewhere. Small talk heavy with pretense. Her silence moved among them like an invisible current, unbothered, untraceable. By the time the company announced the upcoming ceremony, the one meant to honor her years of service, Evelyn already knew it would also serve as her farewell. She had written the CEO's speech herself, as always, editing every word until it sounded sincere. When the day arrived, the applause rose again like a tide, washing over the lies it celebrated. Evelyn stood still, holding her award, listening to the noise collapse into itself. They were applauding her silence. They didn't know it was already learning to speak. In the weeks after the ceremony, the building seemed to hum with a different frequency. Evelyn noticed it in the way lights flickered before stabilizing, the faint delay in the elevators, the silence of her colleagues' footsteps as they passed her office door. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. She had been trained to read between words. Now she was reading between gestures. Every corporate ecosystem runs on rhythm. Meetings, memos, lunches disguised as negotiations. Evelyn had once mastered that rhythm, syncing her pulse to its tempo. But now she moved against it, quietly rearranging her own cadence until she became invisible. She didn't resist the system, she allowed it to overlook her. That was her camouflage. Her new role, as defined by the restructuring memo, was advisory, a title with no power and no permanence. A quiet corner in which to fade. But titles meant nothing to her anymore. Words could be bent, just as systems could be rewritten. She had built both. In the days following her demotion, Evelyn's silence became her method of infiltration. She spent hours revisiting archived press materials, the official record of the company's morality. There, hidden among the platitudes, were the stories she had shaped, the ones that had silenced others. Reports about environmental compliance, charitable donations, ethical sourcing, each one a small fiction crafted to maintain the illusion of virtue. She remembered every lie because she had written them carefully, not carelessly. Each phrase had been a transaction, truth traded for stability. Now those same phrases became coordinates in her reconstruction. Every sentence carried data, names, timestamps, attachments, edits. In her hands, they were no longer words, they were evidence. By the second week, Evelyn's apartment had transformed into an archive of controlled disorder. Notes were pinned to the wall in straight lines. Hard drives labeled in her meticulous handwriting sat stacked beside her desk. Each file represented a moment the company had rewritten history. She approached her plan the way a surgeon prepares for an operation. No anger, no rush, only precision. Revenge, she knew, was a story people told themselves when they needed purpose. This wasn't revenge. This was correction. At night, she replayed the memory of the two men in the hallway, the moment she learned of her removal. It wasn't their betrayal that lingered. It was the sound of their certainty. They believed she would remain silent because silence had built her reputation. They had mistaken restraint for obedience. During work hours, Evelyn maintained her performance flawlessly. She smiled during meetings, delivered reports with measured clarity, and allowed herself to become the wallpaper of the room, present but unregistered. She observed patterns others missed: who lingered near printers, who carried flash drives, whose tone shifted when certain names appeared on email threads. Corporate betrayal, she realized, was rarely theatrical. It was bureaucratic, signed, sealed, time-stamped. The company was preparing for a merger. It was all anyone whispered about, though no one dared name it openly. For months, Evelyn had ghostwritten drafts for executives, statements about synergy and growth. Now she saw those same words being recycled, rearranged to disguise internal decay. She began to construct something of her own, a digital repository buried within the company's intranet, masked under layers of irrelevant data. The architecture was elegant in its simplicity. To anyone else, it looked like a redundant database of archived newsletters. But beneath that ordinary shell lived a system of cross-referenced documents, tagged with metadata that traced every internal inconsistency back to its source. It was her masterpiece, her final act of authorship. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had once been tasked with protecting the company's public image. Now she was safeguarding the truth it had buried. Each night she uploaded fragments, emails, unsigned drafts, legal disclaimers rewritten to hide compliance breaches. She wasn't leaking information. She was preserving it, waiting for the right moment when silence could turn into revelation. Outside, autumn had arrived quietly. The city skyline sharpened under colder light. Evelyn noticed how the morning fog lingered longer near the river, how the sound of traffic softened beneath it. The world, it seemed, had learned her language, measured, deliberate, withholding. At home, she kept the award they had given her on a shelf near the window. The engraved glass caught sunlight during the day, scattering it across the room. Sometimes she caught herself staring at it, watching how light fractured into color. The award was meant to symbolize excellence in communication, yet it had become a monument to restraint. It reminded her that sometimes the loudest truth needed no sound at all. A month into her quiet campaign, she began to notice subtle changes in the company's internal channels. Memos became more cautious. Meetings were rescheduled. The executive floor was locked more often than before. The ripple effect had started, not through confrontation, but through tension. Fear spreads faster than fact. She had planted the first seed weeks earlier, uploading a seemingly harmless internal report to the shared server. It contained nothing scandalous, only data she had corrected. The corrections, however, revealed inconsistencies so small they appeared accidental. But in a corporate structure built on control, even minor anomalies drew attention. They triggered audits, cross-checks, whispers. By the time executives began their investigation, the system had already multiplied the inconsistencies across multiple branches. Every attempt to fix one discrepancy led to another. The system appeared to be glitching. In truth, it was mirroring their own deception, amplifying it until it became impossible to ignore. Evelyn watched from her glass office as IT technicians moved in and out of rooms carrying laptops like surgical tools. She listened to the silence between footsteps, the anxious rhythm of uncertainty. To them, it was a technical malfunction. To her, it was music. She never looked nervous. She didn't need to. Power, she had learned, was not in speaking louder. It was in controlling what others heard. One evening, as most of the staff hurried out under the flickering lights, Evelyn stood by the window overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered with 1,000 offices just like hers, each filled with people who believed silence was safety. She wondered how many of them were crafting their own quiet rebellions, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The next morning, an internal memo circulated, marked Urgent Confidential. It requested immediate review of all archived communications written under Evelyn's supervision. She knew it was coming. She had planned for it. Every document they opened would lead to another, each one immaculate, untraceable, but threaded with the quiet evidence of their hypocrisy. They would not find wrongdoing in her work, only the truth they had tried to erase. The structure of their deceit would begin to fold inward, collapsing under the weight of its own design. Evelyn continued her routine as though nothing had changed. Her composure unnerved those around her. People who once ignored her now watched her with uneasy curiosity. She smiled politely, responded with calm efficiency, and left each conversation emptier than she found it. When the CEO summoned her for a casual discussion later that week, she already knew the purpose. They would try to reclaim control of the narrative, to silence her before she spoke. But they didn't understand. She didn't need to speak. The system was already speaking for her. That night, Evelyn returned home later than usual. She placed her phone face down on the table, turned off the lights, and stood before the window once more. Below, the city shimmered with the same artificial brightness as the boardroom chandeliers had weeks before. She thought about the applause, the practiced smiles, the words she had written to make lies sound noble. Now, somewhere inside the company's servers, those words were rearranging themselves into truth. The architecture of quiet was complete. Soon, it would begin to echo. The collapse began quietly, not with headlines or sirens, but with hesitation, an unread email, a frozen cursor, a meeting that ended before it began. The company had grown used to movement, to the constant hum of forward progress. Now it was the stillness that frightened them. Inside the building, screens blinked uncertainly. Files that once loaded instantly began asking for credentials that no longer existed. Messages bounced back, threads disappeared, links led to archived folders that no one remembered creating. The system wasn't failing, it was remembering. Evelyn came in early that morning. The city outside was veiled in a soft, metallic fog that blurred the edges of glass and steel. Her reflection followed her through the lobby, ghost-like, as if detached from the body that carried it. The security guard greeted her with a strained politeness. He had heard the rumors. Everyone had. Something was wrong at the top. On the 33rd floor, the air was too clean, too cold. The executive suite had been sealed off since the night before. People whispered about a board meeting gone wrong, files exposed, an investigation quietly launched. But no one knew the sequence of events. They only knew that Evelyn's name had started to appear, unbidden, across systems she no longer controlled. The company's internal portal, once a sleek monument to branding and efficiency, had begun displaying a simple phrase beneath its login field: "Authenticity requires acknowledgement." No one could trace its origin. IT teams searched the code line by line, but the message wasn't inserted. It had emerged. It was built from existing fragments, drawn from Evelyn's archived statements, her own words refracted through the structure she'd created. The silence she had written into the system was now rewriting itself. She watched from her glass office as executives moved between rooms, their movements frantic and controlled, as if trying to choreograph calm. No one spoke above a whisper. No one looked at her. Yet her presence filled every corridor. The irony was precise. They had built their empire on language, crafted statements, press releases, messages designed to shape perception. Now language had turned on them. Every hidden clause, every careful omission had reassembled into something undeniable. By noon, the first external inquiry arrived. A journalist had received a trove of data, dates, memos, internal revisions. It wasn't a leak. It was a mirror. Every document sent out was already public information, but now it was cross-linked with metadata that revealed the sequence of manipulation. The company's statement of integrity had been built on altered timestamps. Evelyn had preserved the originals. In a conference room somewhere above her, lawyers were gathering, rehearsing their vocabulary of denial. Down below, interns packed boxes quietly, pretending it was just another day. The illusion was still alive, but faint, like the echo of applause after the hall has emptied. Evelyn sat at her desk, still and deliberate. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't triumphant. What filled her wasn't satisfaction. It was recognition. The story she had built to protect them was finally telling itself truthfully. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the city in sharp relief. She imagined the sound of the morning traffic as applause fading into static. The same sound that had once celebrated her silence was now dissolving into something cleaner, honest, unadorned. By late afternoon, her name appeared in the company's official statement. It was careful, sanitized, predictable. They called her a valued contributor, a respected figure, no longer affiliated. It was the final attempt to reclaim narrative control. But even that statement, within minutes, was pulled apart by the system she had left behind. The language betrayed itself. Every time they tried to erase her, the metadata restored her authorship. Every sentence they altered pointed back to her original draft. The system had learned what she'd always known. Truth doesn't need volume, only permanence. That evening, she didn't go home. She stayed long after the offices emptied, watching lights flicker across the skyline. The building was quiet except for the low hum of servers, steady and rhythmic, like breathing. She could almost feel the pulse of data moving through walls, whispering through fiber lines. Her silence had found its voice. The files she'd arranged within the intranet were no longer static archives. They had begun cross-communicating through embedded logic, correlating information, drawing conclusions, building context. It wasn't artificial intelligence. It was something older and simpler. Consequence. For years she had written to erase truth gently, to cushion it in rhetoric. Now the words were unmasking themselves, each one shedding its disguise. At midnight, she stood and crossed the office one last time. The award still sat on her shelf, its engraved glass now reflecting the glow of the monitors. She picked it up, turning it in her hand. The inscription, "Excellence in Communication," caught the light, fractured it into pale blue shards across her wrist. The irony was almost elegant. She left the award on her desk. It belonged to the building now, to the story that had consumed it. As she walked toward the elevator, she felt a weight lift. Not relief, but release. The kind that comes when something long held finally breathes. Downstairs, the lobby was deserted. The guard was gone. The automatic doors opened soundlessly, and the city greeted her with the faint scent of rain. Outside, the streets glistened beneath the lamplight. She walked without hurry, blending into the rhythm of the city's pulse. Above her, in the office tower she had once served, lights flickered in asynchronous patterns. Rooms going dark, others glowing awake. The system was still running, still unfolding. It didn't need her anymore. Evelyn had written the architecture. Now, it was writing the aftermath. In the days that followed, headlines appeared. Controlled, cautious, brief. Words like data irregularities and governance failure surfaced, then disappeared again, buried under new news cycles. But the echo remained. The story had no villain, no hero, no single confession. It existed in the quiet, between statements, in what wasn't said. Those who had watched her fall remembered her differently now. Some called her a whistleblower, others a ghost in the machine. But Evelyn didn't correct them. She didn't need to. Her silence had become fluent. In the evening, she sometimes returned to the river, standing by the water where the city's reflections trembled. The sound of it, the quiet murmur of current, the distant hum of traffic, felt like a language she finally understood. Somewhere in a boardroom, someone would be rewriting the company's narrative again, trying to rebuild the illusion. But they would never erase her completely. Her words lived in their systems, in their records, in the structure of the truth itself. And when someone, years later, opened a forgotten file, one buried deep within an old archive, they would find a single line at the bottom of a press release. Silence is not absence. It is preservation. No signature. No name. Only the echo.